So good morning. So let's start with the Parsha today. Today we have a double Parsha because this year we only had 1 month of Adar. So we have to fit 54 portions in less than 50 weeks. So we get a bunch of doubles this year. So this is our first double for the year. And this is called Tazria Mitzorah. Tazria being the first one, Mitzorah being the second one. The first portion begins with the woman who's given, and these two portions, both of them have the same theme, which is the laws of Tumah and Tahara, ritual purity. We've touched on ritual purity in various other classes that we have spoken about. There were various laws. A person who was became tameh, became ritually impure in various different ways, some of which are discussed in this week's Parsha. If they become tameh, there's various ways they become tahor, pure, usually through going to the mikveh, though not always. Someone who is tameh is forbidden from going into the temple, from eating holy foods such as the truma that was given to the Kohen, from eating holy foods like sacrifices. Today we no longer have a temple. We no longer keep most of those laws of ritual purity. The only ones that are relevant are the only ones that we still keep today is when a woman gets her menstrual cycle, she becomes tameh, and in addition to the tumah of being forbidden to enter the temple until she goes to the mikvah or eat sacrificial meat, she is also forbidden to have relations until she becomes tahor, and therefore she goes to the mikveh, and that is the only part of tumah and tahara that we still observe. So the first speaks about tumah of a woman after childbirth. She is tameh for a boy after giving birth to a male for 7 days, after a female for 14 days. It does mention in passing that for a male we also must circumcise him on the 8th day. Then it continues to tell us the laws of skin ailment that was called either negaim or tsara'at in the Torah, and it was where one's skin turned white. Doesn't fit with any disease that we know of today. Our sages say that it was a miraculous skin ailment. In other words, it was not naturally occurring, but Hashem rather gave it to people who deserved it. So there was no kind of natural cause for it. But a person who had it was tameh and had to go outside. There's various rules, very complex rules the Torah goes through when their skin turns white, when it's tameh, when it's not tameh, and while they have it, they must go outside of the camp of Israel, or later in Jerusalem, they must be outside of the city of Jerusalem. Then the Torah tells us not only a person could become tameh, also their clothing can get sarat if it turns white, as well as even the homes in the land of Israel. The stones can get sarat if they get this mark, this reddish or yellowish marks on them. And then it gives us the purification process. Once they do become tameh, each one has their own tahara, their own process of becoming tahor, of purification. Then towards the end of the second parsha, Mitzorah, it then moves on to give us other forms of tum'ah. It mentions tum'ah of every time a man has a seminal discharge, he becomes tameh. Every time a woman gets her menstrual cycle or spots, she becomes tameh. And the way they become tahor is by going to the mikveh. Again, we mentioned a woman getting her menstrual cycle is the only one that is relevant today, since she is forbidden to have relations until she goes to the mikveh and becomes tahor. And for that reason, every Jewish community has a mikveh. So that's just a very brief overview of somewhat of a long double parsha, but just very, very quickly. Today is also the the day before Rosh Chodesh, where we mark the new month of Iyar, the second month. We count the months from Nisan, the month of Passover. So the second month of the year is the month of Iyar. We have Rosh Chodesh tonight. It's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. It will be tonight, tomorrow, and Tuesday will be Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Throughout the month of Iyar, we count the Omer during the 49 days from Passover to Shavuot, which is a mitzvah. Ideally, one should do it every evening. If you haven't been doing it yet, I encourage you to download today. You can do it with an app, the Omer app. You can just download it on your phone, and it sends a reminder every evening to tell you to count the Omer. It will ping your phone, and if you look at your phone, you will see it, and that will hopefully remind you, and it will give you both the words to say in the Hebrew, as well as the meditations for each day of the Omer. We have special meditations. So before we continue, let me just take a moment to recite the Omer with you. So repeat after me. Hayom, Arba'a, Asar, Yom, Shehem, Shnei, Shavuot, LaOmer. Today is 14 days, which is 2 weeks of the Omer. We are 2 weeks in. We started counting the Omer. The first night of Passover was a Saturday night. We started counting the Omer on a Sunday night. So Saturday night or Sunday is always the better. You should count the Omer at night, ideally. If you don't do it at night, you do it during the day. But we're exactly 2 weeks in. That's 7 weeks in total, so we have 5 weeks to go until Shavuot. Any questions about the Parsha? Yes, Shari.
What happens after menopause?
Then you do not become Tameh anymore. No issue. No mikveh. However, I should add to that, since you brought it up, I think it's an important point, that a Jewish couple that today we only allow married Jewish women who are married to a Jewish man to go to mikveh. Because it's not used for general purity. That is a misconception. People often call and say, "Can I use your mikveh? I had some bad thing happen to me. I want to use your mikveh." No, the mikveh is a ritual that is for a very specific purpose for a married Jewish woman after her menstrual cycle. So though a couple is married and the woman has not gone to mikveh since her last menstrual cycle, which may have been years ago, right, if they are postmenopause. But if she has not gone to mikveh, then she would still be tameh until she goes to mikveh. And it is important that she goes to mikveh just one time, just even one time, and now she would be tahor. She will remain pure for the rest of her life and never have an issue. Yes?
When somebody dies, you go to the grave or you sit shiva,
Yes.
You're impure.
Yeah, so there are many, many different forms of ritual impurity. We should do a class on ritual impurity, on Tuma and Tahara. There are many forms of ritual impurity. I don't think we've done that yet, have we? But now, to become pure from coming in contact with the dead, the only way to do it is to be sprinkled with spring water mixed with ashes of a red heifer, red cow. And we spoke about it a couple weeks ago when we read about it in the Parsha. It's something that we cannot do today. For that reason, everyone today is tameh. Everyone today is ritually impure. When we did our class about going on the Temple Mount, we explained the reason why it's forbidden today for Jews to go on the Temple Mount is because everyone is tameh, and we have no way of changing that status. So generally, we are all tameh. And it doesn't really matter to us because we don't go to the temple. We don't eat sacrificial meat or other holy foods that require you to be tahor. Today, it will not be relevant until the temple is rebuilt. The only thing that we still observe is for a woman who gets her menstrual cycle that she is forbidden to have relations until she goes to the mikveh. And for that particular tumah, you become tahor, pure, by counting 7 clean days and going to the mikveh.
Is a woman impure when she's had her period?
Yes.
Well, we're using the word impure because there's no real English word for tameh. A woman is tameh. The tumah and tahara is a ritual state that the Torah says that a person has for all sorts of different things. So a woman is in a state of tumah. So perhaps impure is not a valid translation. But we did a class on Nida and on mikveh before. It's on the podcast. Perhaps we need another one on the subject because it's an important subject. Yes?
What about single women?
single women under Jewish law are not supposed to be sexually active outside of marriage. And for that reason, the Jewish communities historically do not allow single women or women who are married in contrary to Jewish law. We do not allow them to go to the mikveh because that would then encourage them to be sexually active, which we don't want them to be. Yes?
You said the mikveh is only for married women having relationships with their husband. But what about the woman that said she has something special going on in her life?
So we get those calls very often. We have a mikveh here at the JCC. I know we've got to get to the Jews of Holland, but I'm just going to answer this one question. We'll move on. We actually get these calls very often at the JCC where women call and say, I had something happen in my life. I want to go to the mikveh. And the answer is there are a lot of wonderful things that we can do in Judaism when something special happens in your life. You can give tzedakah, you can say special prayers. There are many wonderful mitzvahs that we can do. Mikveh is not one of them. Mikveh is exclusively for a woman who is a nida. If you're not a nida, there is no reason to go to mikveh. And it's not used for that. And it's a misuse of the mikveh. And the mikveh should not be misused in such a way. And so it's a misconception. People may remember their mothers, grandmothers went to mikveh and know and don't appreciate why, and therefore they think it's just because, they got sick or something happened. But that is not what mikveh does.
You men go to mikveh?
Yes, but I don't want to get into that discussion right now because we want to get on to the topic for today. Yes, do men go to mikveh was the question for those listening online. Yes, men did go to mikveh when we kept the laws of Tumah and Tahara because they needed it when the temple stood. They still go to mikveh today. They are not required to do so, but it is a custom, and why and under which scenarios, subject of its own for another time. Yes.
Can this delay wedding night activities?
That's an excellent question. The answer is yes, but it's a subject for another time. Yes, definitely.
Is it a separate place where men go than women go?
Yes. Yes. Let's get to our topic for today. So today, I know fascinating questions about mikveh. I think we did two different classes. We once did a class about the laws of family purity and a woman who's a nida that goes to the mikveh. And we did another class once about the mikveh and how mikvehs are built. So we've done both, but I think maybe it's time for another one. But let's get to our topic for today, which is not related whatsoever, at least not directly, the Jews of Holland. The Jews of Holland, which is, I guess, really connects to our various different classes we've done about different Jewish communities. So if we'd like to kind of put it in a series, it'd be part of our Jewish communities series. But a fascinating story. So the Jews of Holland, and I'm using Holland interchangeably here as the country known today as the Netherlands, although technically Holland is just a province within the Netherlands, it's often used as a term for the Netherlands. It's really a story of a relatively new Jewish community, only about 400 years old, that really stood out in many unique ways. It wasn't just another European Jewish community. It was unique in it was unique in a number of ways. It began with its forming. It was formed, as we'll see, in a very unique way. It had unique reach and influence. It was very important in modernization of Judaism. The story of the Jews of Holland is unique, really, among the story of Jews in Europe and Jewish communities in Europe in the modern period. But let's go back before the modern period. In the Middle Ages, now Jews in the Middle Ages, already from the 9th, 10th centuries, lived in much of Europe. So the Low Countries bordering northern France and northwest Germany, today known as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Until 1830, the Netherlands and Belgium was one country. They only split 200 years ago. And so, but that whole region was made up of many principalities. Like most of Europe most of Western Europe, that is, and Central Europe, throughout the Middle Ages was made up of lots and lots and lots of principalities, where there were hundreds, literally, of different principalities, each with their own prince or king or duke that was a sovereign and independent, and usually you traveled a couple miles and you were in a new country. That's how it was in the Middle Ages, with their own coins. That's why they had so many money changers, very Jewish job, right? Because there were so many different coins, hundreds of different currencies in Europe. So that region, like much of Europe, had many, many different principalities. Jews lived in that region, the Low Countries because they're very low. They have low elevation. So the people lived in these areas. Jews lived in these areas, as they did throughout much of Europe. However, in very small numbers. By the 15th century, the lowlands, or in Dutch, the Nederlands, right, the lowlands, note today in English as the Netherlands, were part of Burgundy. Burgundy was a small kingdom that had begun in the early Middle Ages in southern France. Like many kingdoms, due to conquest, marriage, inheritance, it had kind of moved around Europe, and by the 15th century, it controlled the lowlands. It lost much of its southern French control, but it controlled the lowlands, or the Netherlands. In 1506, by secession of the Queen of Burgundy, it passed on to her grandson, King Charles, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor were the original Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were those that were the kings of the Austrian Empire from the 19th century. And of you who know your European history, so the Habsburgs, in addition to having many, many of their own different principalities that they controlled over the years, they were granted by the Pope the title, which was really just a title, Holy Roman Emperor, which made them technically the emperor of much of Germany, although they had very little real power as the emperor of Germany. Their real power was in the lands that they controlled. But this King Charles I was a king of a patchwork of countries and states all around Europe, including Spain. And so in 1506, he gains control of the Netherlands as part of his massive kingdom. And he's also in control of Spain. And he essentially, although it's some distance from Spain, he connects the Netherlands to Spain. And the Netherlands is now essentially a part of Spain. After that, Jews are banned. Those small Jewish communities, not very large, but Jews are banned from living in the Netherlands because they had already been expelled from Spain. In 1492, the Netherlands are now part of Spain. Jews are not allowed to live there. There wasn't any sizable Jewish community, so the impact wasn't that great. However, in the 16th century, Reformation started with Martin Luther in the mid-16th century, really changed things. And many German principalities turned to adopted Lutheranism or adopted various forms of Protestantism that were growing, and Protestantism was growing across Europe. There were a lot of wars fought between Catholics and Protestants, and Protestantism spread to the Netherlands, and particularly in the northern Netherlands. Many of the nobles and the serfs followed them, converted, became Protestant. However, as part of Spain was a very strong Catholic country. Being Protestant was illegal, as it was in most Catholic countries like Spain, France. It was illegal. And so the Protestants were living in violation, and there were constant, and the Spanish crown tried to stop Protestantism from spreading and tried to catch Protestants and force them back into Catholicism. As a result, the Dutch rebelled and declared a republic in 1581. So that's the beginning of and they called it the Netherlands. It covered today all of the Netherlands and Belgium, and it became essentially a Dutch republic. And now, at this time, there were a number of Portuguese crypto-Jewish traders living as Christians in the Netherlands. Excuse me. Jews, of course, had been expelled from Spain in 1492. Many Jews in Spain, however, had converted to Catholicism, some of whom continued to observe Jewish practices in secret. However, in Spain, at least in 1492, when the Jews were expelled, Jews were given an option to convert or to leave. Most Jews left, some converted to Christianity. In Portugal, 4 years later, the Jews were also forced to become Christian on the pain of death. However, or were required to become Christian. However, in Portugal, there was no option to convert or leave. There was only or die. There was only one option: convert. All Jews were automatically, by the declaration of the King of Portugal, automatically considered converted. Henceforth, all Jews of Portugal were now Catholic, whether they liked it or not. They were not allowed to leave. The ports were closed in order to ensure that nobody left. They didn't want the Jews to take all their money with them like they did, or to take all their expertise with them like they did in Spain. And they didn't even really enforce their Catholic practices. So Jews generally continued living as Jews, maybe not as publicly, but as Jews in Portugal, following their official forced conversion. It wasn't until 2 decades later that the Portuguese started forcing the Jews to actually adopt Christianity, and they brought in the Inquisition, and they started persecuting Jews who were caught observing Judaism. At this point, many Portuguese Jews left, but most Portuguese Jews continued outwardly practicing Christianity, secretly practicing Judaism, much more so than in Spain. And the Inquisition was not as bad in Portugal. It was bad, but it wasn't as bad. It was easier to get away with it. Many Jewish traders in Portugal moved to the Netherlands, which was part of Christian Spain, Catholic Spain, so it was easy for them to get to, and they were officially at least Catholics. And over there there were already battles over there between Catholics and Protestants. It was a little bit easier to live as a crypto Jew, so many Portuguese Jews had moved at this time to the Netherlands. By 1581, right? So fast forward 60 years later, or 60 years later, there are, after Jews of Portugal essentially forced to act as Christians, fast forward 60 years later, it's already the grandchildren. They are still practicing Jews in secret, crypto Jews, but semi-secret. It's not that much of a secret, and they're more comfortable in the Netherlands. So a number of them have moved to the Netherlands. So with the new freedom of religion in Protestant Holland, many crypto Jews now begin to openly identify as Jews and practice Judaism, and no one bothers them. Remember, anywhere else in Catholic Europe, if you were officially a Catholic and converted to Catholicism, or your grandparents had converted to Catholicism, and you then adopted Judaism, right, that would be, you would be punished by death for leaving Christianity, for leaving Catholicism. That was a very severe crime anywhere else. Over here in the Netherlands, nobody seemed to bother them as they started living as open Jews and dropping being Christian. And so in the early 17th century, the early 1600s, within about 20 years of the beginning of the Dutch Republic, there's already a sizable community. They're already building synagogues. They begin to hire rabbis. Now remember, these are people who never went to Jewish schools. right, were raised as Christians with secret Jewish observance. So their observance, as you can imagine, there are 2 generations of this already, right? There are 60 years of doing this, more than 60 years. Their Jewish observance is somewhat lax and not, they don't know all that much. But they bring in rabbis from Germany, from Italy, from the Ottoman Empire. They bring in rabbis who can teach them, and slowly they start building a Jewish community. They build a Jewish cemetery. Soon word gets out that this new growing Jewish community in the Netherlands, and many more crypto Jews from Portugal and even Spain move to the Netherlands, mostly to Amsterdam, where they are able to freely re-embrace Judaism. As this community continues to grow, the Sephardic Jews from Italy, from the Ottoman Empire, which were the main places where Sephardic Jews were living in North Africa, move there as well. At first, they're importing their own rabbis, but very quickly, like any good Jewish community, they build Jewish schools. They build a Jewish school system that will last for 400 years. It's still around, at least in some sense today. Originally, it's called originally, I think it's called Talmud Torah, but later it becomes Eitz Chaim, and they build schools. And as their own children now are taught by imported teachers, are taught Talmud and are taught Jewish law, and now they produce their own rabbis. So by the mid-1600s, they already have their own Spanish, their own local Netherlands rabbis that were kind of born locally from local families. Now this new Sephardic, we call it Sephardic, which is really a name for Spain, but it's really primarily Portuguese. This new Sephardic community is very different than any other Jewish community at the time, and probably any other Jewish community in history. They are started by former crypto Jews, practicing Christians. The language they speak, right? Jews elsewhere in most of Europe, in Germany, in Poland at this time, were speaking Yiddish. In the Arab lands, North Africa, Syria, Iraq, were speaking Arabic. In Ottoman lands, in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, the Balkans, Greece, Italy, Jews were speaking Ladina. Here, they're all Jewish languages, unique Jewish languages, right? Here in Amsterdam, Jews, which was the primary community, Jews are speaking Portuguese. That's their language, Portuguese, like regular Portuguese. Not a Jewish version like, a Yiddish or a Ladino. This is a regular Portuguese because that's what they grew up speaking. Now, culturally also, they're indistinguishable from Christians. They dress the way they always dressed before they readopted Judaism. They're dressed like Portuguese. They're dressed like Christians. Most places in Europe, Jews spoke different language. They dressed differently. Here, their language, their dress, their culture is entirely the same as Christian Portuguese around them. Not that different from the Dutch around them. Many of them, so these people are more integrated with their Christian neighbors than Jews anywhere else at the time. They are mostly traders. And this is right after the discovery of the Americas, of the New World. This is a time when the Netherlands, this new country, is becoming, right, which is just formed less than a century after the Americas are discovered. And in the 17th century, which is really, when the settlements are being built all across the New World, and the Dutch are at the head of that. They build, with Jews very much involved, they built the Dutch West Indies Company, which, by the way, was the first corporation, the first company, as we would think of today, corporation. The idea that you could have a company that's its own entity, not just private property of an individual. They built the first stock market in Amsterdam at the time as many companies start growing and to be able to publicly trade these companies. They build the first stock market. All of this happens in what's becoming really the center of world trade at the time. And Jews are very, very much involved in the trade, very much involved in the finances, and Jews are now becoming extremely wealthy. The wealth that the Netherlands gained at the time in the development of the New World, and it's becoming a new colonial power, the Jews are very, very much part of that great wealth. And unlike other countries where the wealth is mostly in the hands of the government, mostly controlled by the government, it's not really private. In English or Spanish or Portuguese colonies were mostly government owned. The Dutch colonies are privately owned. They're owned privately by private. Everything's private. It's a very capitalistic society. Jews are very, very much involved. So Jews have become extremely wealthy. It is by far the wealthiest Jewish community at the time in the 17th century. And furthermore, in the Netherlands, while Jews are not emancipated, they don't have full equal rights. They don't anywhere in Europe at this time. They are limited. They cannot become lawyers. They cannot enter a lot of professional guilds. They could become doctors for some reason. But they were fairly free. They didn't live in ghettos. They didn't have to dress, with special patches or special clothing. They didn't have anti-Jewish taxes and other anti-Jewish rules, as most places in Europe had at the time. The Jews at the time were fairly free. And furthermore, they were protected by the government. The government valued them and protected them. So there were no anti-Jewish riots, no pogroms that were common all across Europe at this time and throughout much of the Jews' 1,000-year time in Europe. All that didn't really exist in the Netherlands. Jews were safe, were pretty free, were very successful, very wealthy, very highly cultured. And they were also at this time, in the 17th century, exposed to the new spirit of enlightenment. The Reformation in the 16th century would give birth in Protestant countries, in German lands, Holland, England, the Protestant lands. It gives birth, and also France to some extent, it gives birth to this new enlightenment, new way of thinking about democracy, ways of government, economics, capitalism, human rights, all these new ideas that end up becoming the kind of foundations of our modern values. So this new spirit of enlightenment starts, and many Jews are very active in the spirit of enlightenment. Some, as the more radical enlightenment thinkers, even take the liberty to kind of think independently, even independently of Judaism. Perhaps the most notable such thinker was Baruch Spinoza, who became a deist, rejecting Jewish beliefs, and as a result is excommunicated from the Jewish community. Any questions? So starting in the early 17th century, as the Sephardic, or really Portuguese community is growing, but they're taught by Spanish rabbis, by Sephardic rabbis, so they're for practical purposes Sephardic. But the Ashkenazic Jews from Germany also begin moving to the Netherlands, this new land of freedom. In 1648, Poland had been the haven for Jews. Poland at the time covers most of Eastern Europe. And Poland had been a haven for the Jews for 300 years, where Jews were protected. Jews who had many, many freedoms. Jews thrived there for 300 years. In 1648, there is an uprising by the Ukrainian Cossacks in Ukraine, led by a fellow called Bogdan Khmelnytsky. I don't remember if we did a class on that, on the Ukrainian uprising, the 1648 uprising. I think we did. But if we didn't, we definitely should do it. And the Cossacks not only dislike the Poles that control them, but they particularly dislike Jews. It was very much a religious war, the Ukrainians being Orthodox Christians, the Poles being Catholics. So they were, it was very much a religious war. They were killing all the heretics. So they didn't just go after Poles, but they went after Jews. And every place they came to, they rounded up Jews, killing every Jew they could find, and that is before they had modern means of mass murder. So it was literally by hand, and enormous numbers of Jews were killed, and many, many more Jews fled. And so many Jews, as a result, left Poland. They spread to many, many different places. The beginning of the communities in Hungary, Romania, and other areas are at this time, but a number of Polish Jews move westward. Many Polish Jews moved back to Germany, where their grandparents had come from hundreds of years earlier, and some of them go to the Netherlands. And so now there is a sizable Ashkenazic community in the Netherlands. Unlike the Sephardic community, which from its very beginning was very, very wealthy, very successful, at the forefront of trade and finance, of what essentially was the world capital of trade and finance, the Ashkenazic community are refugees. They're refugees, they're dirt poor, extremely, extremely poor. The Sephardic community helped them a little. The Ashkenazic community, though, have their own customs. They build their own independent community. And it takes some time. It takes for the Ashkenazim to acclimate to their new society. And with time they do. And many of them become successful. And they build themselves a sizable community. So by the early 18th century, there is a firmly established Ashkenazic community, which is now even larger and stronger than the Sephardic community. This is by the early 1700s. In the early 18th century, they hire Rav Tzvi Ashkenazi, known as the Chacham Tzvi, the most prominent rabbi of the day, as their Ashkenazi rabbi. He was probably the most prominent rabbi to have served in Amsterdam as a rabbi, and at this point in the early 18th century, throughout the 18th century, the Jewish community in the Netherlands, and particularly in Amsterdam, which is where most Jews live, it's by far the largest city, and it's the center. Even in the 18th century, it's the center of trade and finance, and the center of the Dutch colonial power. And in Amsterdam now there's a sizable, wealthy, successful Sephardic community, and an even larger, sizable, wealthy, successful Ashkenazic community, which is now easily the most prominent and most important community in its day in Europe. Yes?
How did they grow so large after World War II?
Well, we're now in the early 18th century, so this is 1700s. So the community in the Netherlands not only grows, and particularly in Amsterdam, not only grows quickly over the 17th century, and it starts from nowhere in 1581, and by 1700, it's the largest, most prominent Jewish community of its day, not the largest, but definitely the most prominent and wealthiest Jewish community of its day. So it also goes on to become a mother community to many others. Something that we have at different points in Jewish history, where there is kind of a single community that spreads its net over many, many other communities, and its influence over many, many communities. And so the Amsterdam Jewish community essentially becomes the same thing. The Sephardic community is by far the largest Sephardic community in Northern Europe, and therefore has influence on smaller Sephardic communities like those in Hamburg and other smaller Sephardic communities in Europe. But Jews from Holland also had invested very heavily in building the New World, in the new Dutch colonies and new Dutch settlements, such as Recife in Brazil, and many Jews, as a result, moved to these colonies to try their luck, to make their fortune. And so many of the Dutch colonies now have Jewish communities, all of which are connected, as the colonies in general are, back to the community in Amsterdam. The Portuguese when the Portuguese capture Recife, and under Portuguese rule, Jews are not allowed to live there because Jews are not allowed to live in Portuguese lands. The Jews leave Recife and move to New Amsterdam, later to become New York, right? Another Dutch colony where, while at first the governor at the time, I think it was Stuyvesant, did not want to accept them, but when they wrote back to the West Dutch Indies Company back in Amsterdam, which had many Jewish members on its board, the West Dutch Indies Company insisted that he do accept them, and they did. And Jews continued to settle both in Dutch lands, in English lands. They couldn't settle in Spanish and Portuguese lands, but they could settle in Dutch, English, and French lands, and they did. In sizable numbers, but all Jews in the New World who still felt connected to that Jewish community in Amsterdam. And they were most of them, they were very small communities. So they would often go back to Amsterdam to find a wife. It was usually men that would go on their own, and then they would come back. They would make their fortune in the New World, go back to Amsterdam to find a wife, or send a message to Amsterdam to tell them to send them someone. They would get their rabbis and their teachers from Amsterdam. Amsterdam essentially was the mother community to all of these communities. Or a little later, Baghdad will serve as a mother community for all the small Jewish communities in the Far East, right? It's in this very similar way. So now Jews had been expelled from England in 1290. England once had a sizable Jewish community. Jews were expelled in 1290. So Jews were not allowed to live in England any time after 1290. Now many Dutch Jewish traders who were doing business all over Europe did business in England, just across the English Channel. And they were able to go there for business, but they were not allowed to live there. Jews were forbidden from living there. It appears there were some Jews living there and nobody bothered them, but officially Jews were not allowed to live in England. From 1290. In 1650, one of the rabbis of the Sephardic Amsterdam Jewish community, Menashe ben Yisrael, who was Amsterdam born, he was born to Portuguese parents and had learned in the local schools and become a great rabbi and a great scholar. He publishes a book called Mikveh Yisrael, The Hope of Israel. And it's really a book describing eyewitness accounts of Jews from Recife, or Suriname, which was in the New World. I think it was actually from Suriname, which was a Dutch colony also. Jews who had met American Indians or American natives and had discovered that these American natives are from the 10 lost tribes. And he writes this account, and he argues in it that the discovery of the 10 lost tribes in the Americas is evidence that the Moshiach is coming, that the salvation is near, and we have to get ready for the coming of Moshiach.
When was that? What year?
1650.
Oh,
How did he determine they were Jewish?
Long story of its own for another time. How did he know they were Jewish? It's a whole story, but we could do the story about finding the 10 lost tribes one of these days. We'll do a story. It's a fascinating story, finding the 10 lost tribes in the Americas. So having argued the redemption is near, he, however, points out, and he's friends with a lot of Christian Enlightenment scholars at the time, and both in Holland and elsewhere, and he points out that we know that when Moshiach comes, Jews will be scattered from the four corners of the earth. Will be scattered in the four corners of the earth, and Hashem will gather them from the four corners of the earth, meaning that Jews must be found everywhere. However, there is one corner of the earth, at least if you look on the map, it looks like the corner, where Jews are not found, and that is in England. Right? The British Isles is in the corner of Europe, and there's no Jews there. And therefore, Jews must be readmitted to England in order for Mashiach to come. And at the time, this was right after when England had become a republic, and Oliver Cromwell was at the time the leader of England, And as a Puritan, and the Puritans were at that time in control in England, and Puritans were both loved Jews in general, were philo-Semites generally, and had a very different attitude than most Catholics and Protestants at the time, and they were also eagerly awaiting the coming of their Messiah. So Oliver Cromwell hears about it, and he's very sympathetic. And he invites Menashe ben Yisrael to England to address Parliament and argue to Parliament for the Jews' return to England, which he does, and then publishes his address in a book in English. And Jews are then allowed to settle in England in 1656, thanks to Menashe's efforts. Who are the Jews that settle in England? They are traders from Amsterdam, right? Jewish traders who already had business in England, right? Settle in England, send people in England, representatives to England. So they are essentially an extension of the same Sephardic, the same Dutch community in Amsterdam. And so Amsterdam now becomes essentially this mother community to other Sephardic communities in Europe, to the communities in England, to all the communities in the New World, all being connected back down to Amsterdam. During the 18th century, the Netherlands is at the height of trade. It has a large as 1700s. It has a large colonial empire. It still has possessions in the lost New Amsterdam, but it still has possessions in the New World. And the Jewish community is large. It's successful, financially very, very wealthy. It has freedoms that are not enjoyed anywhere else in Europe, which means that the Amsterdam Jewish community plays a unique role as the most important, prestigious Jewish community in the world. It has both Sephardic and Ashkenazic, sizable Sephardic and Ashkenazic communities, which was rare. Very few cities had both, right? Those were either or. And therefore, it influenced both Sephardic Europe as well as Ashkenazic Europe. One notable part of its influence was that by the 18th century, remember the prior kind of center in the 16th century, before Amsterdam became a big center, the prior trade center for Europe was Venice, right? Venice had been the old center. By the 17th century, Venice had kind of declined, and Amsterdam really took its place as the center of Europe. But at that time, in the 16th century, Venice, as part of its role as the kind of center of trade in Europe, it was also the center of printing for Europe, including the center of Jewish printing. With the decline of Venice and the rise of Amsterdam, Amsterdam becomes the new center of printing in Europe. And unlike Venice, where the Venetians, also a republic, but where the Venetians heavily censored everything that was printed, because censorship was just a normal thing in Europe, and they heavily censored everything. In Amsterdam was a pretty free society. You could essentially print whatever you wanted and get away with it. And so there was virtually no or very little censorship in Amsterdam. So it therefore became a center for Jewish printing. Many rabbis came there to print their books. Many Jewish classics were printed. In fact, Amsterdam was known also for high quality printing. It was real quality. Often other printers elsewhere in Europe would advertise that they printed with plates or fonts from Amsterdam because it was high quality. If you do Amsterdam was like, today you'd say, Italian suits. So it was Amsterdam printing. It was a kind of meant high quality. Also at the time, the Jewish community in the land of Israel was small, was struggling. There wasn't really much development as the Ottoman Empire was declining. There wasn't much development in the land of Israel. Jews were mostly supported by money coming from, we did a class on it a little while back, but Jews were mostly supported by money coming from the diaspora. And Jews in various countries were sending money. Much of that money was going through Amsterdam because Amsterdam was a very capitalist country. A lot of countries didn't get along with the Ottoman Empire, and sending money directly to the Ottoman Empire was not safe, right? Amsterdam was the center of trade. You could send money to Amsterdam and they would send it on to the land of Israel. Throughout the 17th, particularly in the 18th century, and even into the 19th century, the Jewish community in Amsterdam essentially was responsible for the development of the land of Israel. And part of that is they also coordinated not only distribution of funds in Israel, but also various forms of infrastructure that were built, and synagogues and schools were funded through Amsterdam. So it was really a kind of a center for the Jewish community. The Jewish community built a very modern school network, the Eitz Chaim, that had really no parallel elsewhere in Europe. While virtually every Jewish community had proper schools. But the schools were not always well funded. The teachers were not always well paid. There wasn't kind of a modern school as you think of it today. It was often a bunch of kids sitting in a room on the floor, kind of led by a teacher without much of a curriculum. Eitz Chaim was the first modern Jewish school with a real curriculum, with proper teachers, real classrooms, as we would think of education today. This school system really produced highly educated young men who were both highly educated in general subjects as well as great Torah scholars. There were many great Torah scholars coming out of Amsterdam. In the late 18th century, right? So this is following the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. So the French capture the Netherlands as part of Napoleon's conquest of Europe. The French rulers, as they had done in France, grant full emancipation to the Jews of Netherlands. In fact, as the French continue and end up conquering most of Europe before eventually Napoleon's armies collapse, but they bring emancipation everywhere in Europe. In most places, after the fall of Napoleon, most of that emancipation is reversed. The Jews go back right to the way they were beforehand. Not in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, following the fall of French rule, the Jews remain emancipated with full equal rights, full citizenship, where Jews are treated exactly as Christians in the Netherlands, from the early 1800s. But following the defeat the days of the Republic end. First, Napoleon appoints his brother as king over the Netherlands, and then following the defeat of the French, the last prime minister the last president of the Netherlands declares himself king, and the Netherlands becomes a monarchy, which it still is today. Not long after that, there's friction in the Netherlands between the northern side, which is Protestant, the southern half, which is Catholic, and in 1830, the Netherlands split into two. The southern half becomes Belgium, right, a Catholic country, and after that, the Netherlands really never gets back to its former glory. Amsterdam loses its spot as the center of world trade, to be greatly surpassed by London, right, which would be the great center in the 19th century, and Amsterdam never really, and Holland never really regains its shine, and as a result, due to the loss of wealth in Amsterdam, the Jewish community is much less wealthy than it had been, and as a result also loses much of its influence that it had before. Yet, although it's not as wealthy as it had been and not as influential in the 19th century, it continues to grow because Jews continue to come in large numbers, particularly from Eastern Europe, where Jews are really persecuted. In the Russian Empire, Jews are facing now terrible persecution, and so many Jews flee west, many going to different places, but among the various places they go to is the Netherlands. So many Jews, so the Sephardic community is relatively quite small by now, because it never really grows significantly after that, but the Ashkenazi community continues to grow and grow and grow. Emancipation, though, also leads to assimilation, as it does everywhere else. And many Jews in the Netherlands drop parts of Jewish practice, all of Jewish practice. Many marry out of the faith, as begins to happen in Germany and in other places where Jews receive emancipation, as happens elsewhere. And yet a significant minority of Jews remain observant. There's still a strong, solid Jewish community. And this continues into the 20th century. By 1930, there are well over 100,000 Jews living in the Netherlands, majority of them not observant. However, there is still a very strong Jewish community, primarily Ashkenazi. There's a couple thousand Sephardic still there, but many Sephardic had assimilated. It hadn't really grown or got any influx since the 17th century, while the Ashkenazi community had continued to grow with constant migration from Eastern Europe. And so it's primarily Ashkenazi, but it's a very, very large and very well integrated Jewish community in the Netherlands. When Hitler rose to power in 1933 in Germany, which is just next door, many German Jews left Germany, went to wherever they could. And as anti-Jewish laws got worse and worse, more and more Jews left. They went wherever they could. Many of them went to the Netherlands, really swelling the Jewish community in the Netherlands. After Kristallnacht in 1938, what had been a trickle of Jews leaving Germany from 1933 became an avalanche. Every Jew in Germany tried to find a way to get out. The vast majority of Jews in Germany did get out of Germany in the 1930s. Many of them go to the Netherlands. By the time of the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940, there are over 150,000 Jews living in the Netherlands. About 20 to 25% of them were German refugees that had come in the previous decade as a result of German persecution. When the Germans invaded in 1940, they immediately began making anti-Jewish laws. The Dutch, who for 300 years had been so tolerant of Jews, it had been one of the most tolerant places in Europe. One of the only places where Jews had freedoms when nobody else did. The Dutch now turned on the Jews. There was an active Dutch Nazi party that had already been active in the 1930s, and as there was in some other countries as well, there were Nazi parties that had connected with the German Nazi party. Many Dutch joined the Nazi party. It became very, very large and active, and they joined in persecuting Jews. Between 1941 and 1943, almost all the Jews in the Netherlands were deported to Poland, where they were murdered. Very, very few Jews were able to hide or escape the Netherlands. There wasn't really too many places you could go to. They were surrounded by Germany all around. There was really no way out. Hiding in the Netherlands was challenging because there were so many Dutch aiding the Nazis who would turn in Jews who were hiding. The most notable Dutch Jew that was turned in was Anne Frank, Anne Frank, who was deported, was hiding in Amsterdam and was deported, was turned in and by a Dutch and was deported with her family to Auschwitz. She died, and her father, though, survived. Less than 10% of Dutch Jews survived the war. One of the worst of any country in Europe. One of the worst. There were some others that were pretty bad. Poland, and there's some others that got hit. But the Dutch were among the worst. After World War II, the Jewish community in the Netherlands slowly rebuilt, but was a fraction of its former size. Many of the original Dutch Jews came back. Some went elsewhere, to Israel, to the Americas, to the United States, to other places. Many of them came back. Many non-Dutch Jewish refugees, survivors, settled. Many of them went elsewhere, but many of them settled in Western Europe, many of the survivors, including in the Netherlands. So there were many Jews from other places, Eastern Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, refugees that settled in the Netherlands, growing the community a little bit. Later, with the fall of the Soviet Union, some Soviet Jewish refugees, they went to many, many places, primarily Israel. They came to the United States, to Canada, and various places in Europe. So a number went to the Netherlands as well. So today there's about 30, 40,000 Jews in the Netherlands. And the vast majority of them are Ashkenazim. There's still a small Sephardic community. The original Sephardic synagogue still stands, the original Portuguese synagogue that they had, but but the community is much, much smaller than it had been. It's still a strong community with shuls, schools, kosher markets, kosher restaurants, of course, a place where many Jews go to visit. Unfortunately, in recent years, there's been a huge rise in anti-Semitism in the Netherlands. This is mostly coming not from local Dutch, but from Muslim immigrants. Problem right now across Europe, where Muslim immigrants in many countries in Western Europe have brought an enormous amount of anti-Semitism. So the story of the Jews of Holland is a story of a fascinating community that began in a very unique way, started by crypto Jews, and for well over a century, for the entire 18th century at least, was the most important and most influential community in the Jewish world. The wealthiest, most important, most influential community. It's now a fraction of what it has been, and yet it retains that strong legacy, and that had a very strong impact on the Jewish world in general. So I thank you all for joining. And just a few quick things. Firstly, next week, come back. We will next week talk about cross-breeding plants and the prohibitions of cross-breeding plants, or kilayim in Hebrew. We are starting also some new things coming up. Firstly, you may have seen some of the emails. We are starting a new class in a book called Tanya. We did once our Sunday morning class about the Tanya. Tanya is a book based on Chassidus, based on Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, on how a person can maximize their potential to become a better person, better servant of God. And it's a very, very powerful book, probably one of the most notable, one of the classic Jewish books on self-development. And so we're starting a class this coming Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Some of you I know already told me you're going to join. Anyone who wants is welcome to join. Just let me know if you'd like to join. And then next week, meaning a week from Wednesday, on May 7th, we are going to start a 4-week course called Colorful Profiles, where we're going to go through the profiles of 12 fascinating, not so well-known Jewish figures. So we're going to look at, and with different things, we're going to look at converts, fascinating converts throughout our history. We will look at heroines, Jewish women who achieved remarkable things, not the famous ones, right? Ones that you probably have not heard of. We're going to look at